God bless. I am Mark Anthony DiBello. I am the firstborn son of my father, and I am here to eulogize him this day. Truly, it's not in the traditional way, but if anybody knew my dad, he was very untraditional. The Holy Bible, a book, is a lifelong Christian Catholic my father believed in, opens with the words, "In the beginning, God created." It would later go on to say, "Be fruitful and multiply." In the beginning, God created. In the beginning speaks to time. Father God is time eternal in the past and in the future. God created. God is a creator. That's who he is. My father was also a creator, because the Bible would also go on to say, "Be fruitful and multiply." This was not just an admonition of the Lord. It was also a command, but it was also an observation that the Lord would look down on his creation and say, replicate, duplicate, procreate. In fact, it was and is a power that even God himself, who, if you believe in his first and only begotten Son, Jesus, it's something Jesus himself didn't even do. So it's a life-giving and life-saving power that human beings or man has, that even in ways God himself doesn't have. And certainly Jesus didn't do. In the beginning, God created. So, and to be fruitful and multiply, if we look at the animal kingdom, who was here created before us, because God created the heavens and the earth, and then the animal kingdom, we can witness them, observe them, mating and procreating and giving birth. And because God loves creation so much, that's why he created multiple spheres and suns and stars and moons and planets in space. Thousands of incredibly amazing and wondrous animals, and then the animal or creation man. Now, I'm not one of the belief system of Darwin where creation was evolved from or morphed sort of from the animal kingdom, but I do believe God looked at his animal creation, paused, said he did a good thing, which he remarked about all the creation he made after the beginning, and saw that he would now create man. My dad was one of those creations. The life of Tony DiBello my beloved dad, who was called Anthony Francis, Tony, D, then later by his children, lovingly, reverently, the old man, and then by me in the latest years of his life, because others had called him Poppy, a derivative of Grandpa. I called him Popsicle. My beloved Popsicle. Not only because my dad enjoyed dining or eating more than anything, I think, on this earth, but my dad did so because he enjoyed life, and he felt being fed gave him life. It was a part of the animal kingdom that my dad loved. I guess, you see animals grazing in the field. My father loved animals, dogs, like his first dog, Rennie, and cats, horses. He loved all animals. So as I eulogize him today in this unique and untraditional way, because I, being his firstborn son, am cut from the same cloth. His son Joseph remarked once that, the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, which is certainly a quote of somebody else, but in the life and family of Tony DiBello or Anthony, truly his children, he was a father, the best of fathers. And my father came into existence when, and in a traditional way, when the Italians came to America, specifically in New York City, came a gentleman named Ralph DiBello. My father's dad was a tall man, a strong man, a hard-working man, a good man, a man who spoke broken English, spoke primarily Italian. When he arrived in this country, I think I'm certain of this timeline. My father's father, Anthony's father, landed in Mechanicville, New York, town his father was most proud of. That's where he met a woman, I believe 7 years his senior, named Josephine Enzonia. The two of them would be wed. And growing up, and my dad loved movies, and you can see this referenced in a lot of movies, and before the Depression, but at the turn of the century, wasn't easy for Italians or Italian Americans at this point. But in a very traditional way, in a good way, Ralph and Josephine, one Dad's children would later we called her Sketty Mama when we first went to see her, because she always made us spaghetti. So my dad was born of Ralph and Josephine. He was the youngest of 6 children. Their firstborn son was Mark John, from whom I'm named in the Italian tradition. You're named after the eldest brother, and my middle name is after my dad. And I couldn't be more beloved or proud to bear that name, and to be made in the image and the likeness of Dad, my daddy, just the way, as my father believed in Jesus Christ, the Son was created in the image of the Father, and mankind created in the image of God. So there was Mark John, and I might have the order incorrect here, but then I believe his sister Mary, and then his brother James, or Vincent James, called Slim, then his sister Josephine, called affectionately Babe, and then his brother Joseph, Ralph DiBello, later nicknamed UJ, and then there was my dad, the youngest, the baby of the family, who by all of his brothers and sisters in some ways was babied, a mama's boy, if you will, but also would grow to be the strongest, and I'll use the word successful, but my dad and I didn't think of success necessarily as in money, but success is in spirituality and godlyhood and being a family man and a father and a good son to his mom and dad. So my dad, growing up, was very unique in his family. In fact, there's a gentleman in the Old Testament of the Bible named King David, who was the youngest in his family and rose to be king, and one with, in the scriptures, God says that David was one with whom would do very much to perpetuate the Christian faith, and my dad grew up, and this is part of, I guess, the uniqueness of this eulogy, that my dad, he had many gifts and was very appreciative of those gifts and knew that they came from God and from good parents who were not frivolous and like I am, to be honest. But again, my dad, and I apologize for incorporating me into any of this, but I'm so proud to be my father's son, cut from the same cloth and more like him than anybody on earth ever could be. And I am, it's the greatest thing that I can ever say or be, is to say that I was my father's and I am my father's son. I could never do anything greater than that. And my dad, he knew how to be a father. So growing up, again, he was a traditional kid, charismatic and energetic, youthful, even at his young age, like he was youthful all his life for his age, youthful in spirit and mind, but for lack of a better word, aged in things like wisdom and intelligence and love. So my dad grew up in Mechanicville in days where he was delighted in telling stories and reading stories and watching stories, and very blessed to write, a gifted writer. And so my dad used to often revel with me in his stories of his youth and teen years and growing up in Mechanicville, and these are outlined. And being that I'm giving this eulogy, my dad died on Easter Day, March 31st, 2024, and today is early Monday morning, I think April the 8th. And I'm just going to give this eulogy in this way, and then eulogize my dad, and then you'll understand. Well, you'll understand. So my dad grew up in, like I said, a primarily Italian town of Mechanicville, which he loved his town, he loved his family, he loved his friends, he loved his first dog, Rennie. There's a beautiful picture of my daddy in a little white suit, looking like a little Italian boy with his little dog by his side. But my dad, and again, prayerfully, this eulogy will long outlive me and has outlived him. And it can be seen online, which is the way, we communicate these days. My dad grew up in an era of newsprint. In fact, his father, Ralph, worked at the local paper plant in Mechanicville, where a lot of men labored. It was hard work, but it was, as they would say, put food on the table. And that's why I said, growing up, my dad used to take us to, I still remember the white table with the red trim and these heavy forks and spoons, which were like, I don't know, for something from medieval times, and these tools, they were so heavy sometimes. But we always loved going to see my grandpa, and because, as I said, she always made us spaghetti, and we called her Sketty Mama. At least I certainly called her Sketty Mama. And so growing up, my dad, again, he ended up going to Mechanicville High, where he was proud to graduate, but being that his father, Ralph, worked in the paper plant and his mom was a homemaker to the other 5 siblings of my dad, college wasn't the type of thing. Plus, my dad had, he would say often he went to the school of hard knocks, meaning, and I say that, I said it, hard knocks, in a tone of a television show that's on, because, like my dad, he loved football and he taught me to love football, but I apologize again for this imperfect presentation, as my dad would often say. He sometimes would often apologize for his imperfectness and would say, "I gave up being perfect yesterday." My dad had the best sense of humor. He had so many gifts, his best sense of humor. He loved to make people laugh. He has such a genius for the spoken word and the written word, and a flair and a dramaticism and a uniqueness he gave it and spoke it and wrote it. He would love to just use. He didn't have, let's say, a college-educated literacy with regards to vocabulary, but he always had unique words that had power to them, and panache, I guess, is one of them he might use. I remember from an old show we used to love to watch together called The Odd Couple, but because my dad, again, he loved people he loved life most of all, first and foremost, but he also loved people and communication. So, and in all forms, even music, and I'll get to that, because after my dad, around his high school time, he began working in the upstate New York area, Saratoga, Mechanicville, Stillwater, up Glens Falls, Albany. He worked in radio and television, when television was in its infancy in black and white. And he also had, my dad, a love for show business, and he was a performer at heart, which is why he did some acting and commercials, and with some people well known in, particularly a gentleman named Ted Knight, who used to play Ted on the Mary Tyler Moore Show. My dad was always proud of the commercials he did with Mr. Knight. and some local spots. And then he did a lot of promotional work with the radio station and then television. And this is outlined because my dad would eventually get into publishing, so I'm jumping ahead. But a lot of this is outlined in a book that he wrote. But again, I try not to jump ahead, but it's hard not to jump ahead. Think ahead when it comes to my dad. It's just because he was a visionary in many ways, and I just think of where we are in life today with my daddy. With my daddy not being here on this planet today. So my daddy was a hard-working man. Hard-working man. But he loved to work. He actually loved it. And he exploited the gifts that he had. His humor, as I mentioned, his intelligence, his flair for the dramatic, his ability in many ways to lead and to speak. I mentioned he had love of animals and music and, good old Italian food. And so, the things of life. So when it came to my father's further employment at the radio station, he was a manager, and then he worked in promotions. I can't quite remember now because I'm becoming an elderly man myself. Thank God for my dad, because I wouldn't have lived past 21 if it wasn't for the love of my dad. But again, I try not to incorporate me with the sense of what one of his daughters would say. It's not about you, Mark. But you know what? I'm so proud to be my father's son. So incredibly pleased and in love and proud. And my dad, he was not only my father, but he was a God in many ways. Not to be irreverent to God, the Heavenly Father, but my dad was a God to me, and he was also a hero. And when we read the scriptures, in the Old Testament, in the Ten Commandments, it says, I believe it's the fifth commandment, to honor thy father and mother. Now I, as one who, and my dad loved ministry work, he loved the church, and I just remember writing recently, the reason we honor our father and mothers is because it teaches us to honor life. And there's nothing more precious than God, who is love, and because of God's love, life. So my dad, as I said, he began working in radio and television. And again, each year that went by in my dad's life, he became more and more godly and spiritual. And he was a Roman Catholic. And so he always had a good nature and a good morality and a good mind and a huge, huge heart. My dad had the biggest heart. Love for God and for the animal kingdom and people, as I mentioned. So my dad at one point worked in promotions as a promoter in music. And I was blessed to later do a film online about him called The Promoter, hour-long documentary. And my father worked with some of the biggest names back in that day in show business: Johnny Mathis, Johnny Cash, Eddie Arnold, Trini Lopez. told me countless stories about his days with those men, and even had an interaction with the colonel, and who was downstairs, and Dad tried to bring Elvis to the area, to Albany, and Elvis was appearing, I think, in Buffalo or Boston, one or the other. And my dad also worked with the Beatles. He was one of the first promoters in the area through his friend Howard Sennett, to somebody in the music business, to bring the Beatles to the United States. And Dad had the vision to have them play in a racetrack venue in Vermont, and that story's online, and it featured in the promoter. And Dad also worked with somebody, used to sort of hang out with somebody he knew named Frank Sinatra. There's something in the promoter called A Brush with Greatness, where Mr. Sinatra, who my dad, sometimes in a sense was in his entourage, I guess if you want to say that, would go up to my dad. And my dad loved to tell a story of how Mr. Sinatra put his hands through my dad's hair and said, "God, I wish I had a hair like that." Then my dad also tells the story of how Frank Sinatra, the one my father always called the master, he said Frank was the master. And my father told it, in a sort of, again, a way like a Martin Scorsese movie, a Godfather or a Casino, or a movie like that, or but I forget the other third movie. But my dad would, tell like, oh, how Frank, punched my dad, although he was swinging by accident. But watch the promoter. It's good. My dad liked it. Thank God he got to see it before he passed. So my dad was in music and loved it, and ahead of his time, I think, in that regard. Certainly not in the big time, but my dad, like me, had so many interests and so many talents and abilities. And when you're that way, blessed to be that way, you sort of divest yourself. I don't think deluded is the right word, but you just have so many varied interests, a little bit of everything, and not just, too much of one of anything, if that's even properly said. But after, at one point during his music life, I think it was I don't know if it was before or after, I can't think right now, my dad was called to service during the Korean War down to Aberdeen, and my dad enjoyed I don't want to say enjoyed, but he was in special services. So I have to think maybe it was after his life as a promoter, but maybe in relation to him being a manager at the radio station or television. And down in the service, my dad, you could just probably make a whole movie about the way my dad's life, not my life certainly, but my dad's life was made. I apologize. I'm back. I would say, as my dad used to just joke, I ran out of battery. He would say battery instead of batteries. I also wanted to mention this hat that I'm wearing here. I don't know if you can see it. There's a story behind this hat I wear in honor of my daddy. My daddy gave me this hat. He knew the Colts were my favorite team, and for years I would wear this hat. And then, in a loving way, because my dad didn't have a thieving heart and definitely not a lying one. I'll get to that. I'm sorry. But my daddy would, I think he took this hat back from me. He was cold one night. And he used to, even with his full head of hair, even till his dying day, he liked to wear a wool hat, or sometimes he would just wear it, I don't know, for comfort or warmth, or just habit, I guess. But he took it back from me, I think, or I might have gave it to him. I think I took it back. I think yeah, I think he just took it back. And then I don't know, many years later, I came to his house and I took it back from him. Not in a in a negative way, but a godly, we love each other way. And then and then so yeah, so I gave it back to him. He gave it. I took it back from him. Then he last gave it to me, and that's why I wear it in honor of him today. So I apologize I didn't tell that story right. My dad could always tell a good story. I usually do a little bit better with writing, and if I have time, well, it doesn't matter about editing a video. So my daddy, going back to after I was speaking about him working in music, he went to the Army, served in the Korean War. I don't believe he ever went overseas. He served in special services here, and then, whether it was before or after being a promoter, he was working at a beauty, as a judge in a beauty pageant, I believe down in Troy, New York, and that's where he met Dorothy Leona Burek, pretty, petite farm girl next door, I guess you might even say, just beautiful, nice brunette who would later always want to be platinum blonde. Oh, God loves my mom. Another big-hearted, huge-hearted woman, loved life and being a mother, and also had her fun-loving, just playful side, whether it was sports or, reading a book she used to love to do, and, certainly just was born in many ways to be a mother. That's why she was born. And to be my dad's mother, my dad's wife and my mother. Perfect combination, because they fell in love, and I just read they still were married on April 11th, 1959 at St. John's Church in Albany, New York. Some nice black and white pictures of my dark-haired, I'd like to think like Valentino, dad, and my pretty Marilyn Monroe type mom, even though she was brunette back then. So they wed, and because Dottie, or the one we would later affectionately call Lots, as in lots of dots, and she loved being called Lots for a while. Sometimes she'd be, like my dad too, like, he knew when to have class and be formal and, or business-like, as it were. And sorry, I'm moving the camera. And so, he would, proudly call her Dorothy or Dottie, So, I apologize. Oh, I dropped the light. Oh, God bless. Hold on. I apologize. There's the light. The older I get, the more like my dad I get. Got a little discombobulated, but that's okay. I can't escape, who I am, and I only say that to say something because I had thought about what I might say in advance before I started taping, and that was that being brought up, and I'll get to Dorothy and Tony giving birth here. I can totally see, as I say, I didn't take a far dip from the gene pool, being just like that of my dad, where some of the other kids, actually there's 8 children, and 5 of whom I think are more of the Italian dominant nature, and 3 who are of the Burek bloodline, more so. And but having said that, I'm proud to have, the genes of my dad and my mom, and I wholeheartedly believe because I was the firstborn, but because I just think I was blessed with their heart to have the most love or be the most favorite of my mom and dad, as it probably should be, but they loved all their children. They loved all of them. If they didn't love them, they wouldn't have had them, and they just love all of them. And they, but I also feel like I was born sort of like always trained by my father, like when you teach somebody lessons in life, or you do the things, and my father exposed me and all his children to doing everything we wanted to, could think of. I know he did it because, many ways he wanted us to find something we'd be blessed or gifted at or could do for a life's work, I guess, or for play. I mean, my father loved play as much as he loved work, and so did my mom. Another incredibly hardworking and, comedic and just thoughtful, kind lady. I don't know why I say lady. She's my mom. So I think I have to use that word formal. So anyway, so after they wed, I believe about a year, well, do the math. In December 18th, 1960, I was born, and I was born in Glens Falls, up where my dad had bought a house for he and my mom, and I remember one story, again, not to make this about me, but when I was just a child, and I think I was the only one, maybe Joey was his second born. I think I mentioned Mark, Joey, Lisa, Brad, Tony, Amy, Julie, and Susan would be their children. But when I was born, I got lost. My mom let me play in the backyard, and I think she either turned to check on Joey or, and the next thing you know, I was off and running in the woods. Oh, no, wait, that wasn't Glens Falls. This was later. I apologize. This was down when we got to Zelinki Drive. So my mom had been from Rensselaer, actually North Greenbush or DeFriesville, New York. And so my dad moved down to that region. It's to sort of, in a way, start his life over. And that's when they settled at a little home off Zelinki Drive behind what is now Belltop School, where they would send, I think, all of their kids at some point went through Belltop. And that's when I got lost in the backyard, and I remember the story of my mom frantically calling the radio station, and the radio station put out on the air, on the radio, sort of, Tony DiBello, if you're listening, call your office. My dad would, I think, been in his little Thunderbird convertible, or maybe a hardtop, I don't know, but and then he rushed to get back home. And my mom must have been crying and frantic, and started running in the woods herself. And my dad assembled a team of, I think there was like 50 local fire people from, the rescue squad. And they would eventually, one of them would find me, a man who I would later meet, I want to say the son of a gentleman named Art Dell. It might have been Art Dell Jr. They were volunteer fire people in the area, and they found me sitting there with a lost shoe, crying on a log. Tragically, though, but thankfully near a sort of a cliff or ravine with some water below, I think, where I could have easily tumbled over and died and drowned. But there was an article in the paper, not that my dad had anything to do with it, just I still remember it. I still have a copy. It just said, Mark Anthony wandered and wept for adventure. But anyway, so after my dad and his wife Dottie had me, it would just be a year until their second son, Joseph Michael, was born, and then after that would be Lisa Ann, and then they would take a break, I guess. I don't want to say take a break, but however they were thinking in their minds, before they would have Brad and Bradley Ralph, named after his father, Tony Marie, Tony with an I, named after her father, Amy Teresa, and then Julie Francis named with an E after her, my mother's, or Anthony's wife's mother-in-law, Frances Beyer Burek, and then the littlest, which is Susan Elizabeth, who I just remember my parents were going to discussing whether to name her Sarah or Susan, and I think they're glad they landed on Susan. And so anyway, so it was when my dad moved down to that area, more downstate, from Saratoga, in a region he loved, and he was even going to the racetrack up there. My dad loved horse racing, and which I'll talk about here. But he loved horse racing, but moved down and started a career in publishing. He published a local penny saver newspaper, and then in East Greenbush, New York, and then what was called the Greenbush Area News, and they started, to build again their family. And after me, Joey and Lisa, which we would eventually, after Brad, Tony, Amy, Julie, and Susan were born, we were divided between the Bigs, who were the three big ones, the three first, and the Lutz. So always growing up, we were the Bigs and the Lutz. And it made for, just I don't know, it was just between us, I guess. So my dad, continued his work, and my mom used to work for my dad. And in fact, her sister, our Aunt Helen, started out helping my mom in the basement, pasting together the local penny saver, and then eventually, like a lot of families, and my dad wanted to do it the right way and the traditional way, and certainly the godly way. And after he got his business a little bit established and my mom started to have kids, she became a full-time housewife or homemaker, and my mom loved it and was incredibly blessed and good at being that. She had a strong, feminine sense, but also a submissive, like to serve the husband type of thing. And my dad, was a good father, a good leader. He knew, when to be strong and firm, but he was also, still a little child at heart in his own way. And he knew when to let my mom take the reins. And, and my mom one day, and you'll hear this, he came to realize she was definitely in ways the head of the family, and that was a good thing. So it was, and through our high school years, we're all blessed to have the same attributes of my dad and my mom: athletic, and we were a close-knit family, very loving, and some of us had a dramatic side to us, some of us had a business side to us. And when I speak of Anthony's children, you can just look at them however you might see them, and see the seeds that Anthony and Dorothy planted. I mean, myself, and I say spiritually, and show, sports growing up, and show business, things my dad loved. And you look at Joseph Michael and his love, of business and of being a horseman, also sports, things that parts of my dad and mom, and Joe was one of the Burek side that I mentioned earlier. Then it would be Lisa, who was an Italian in nature, and did a lot of stuff with the town and politics. And my dad, was a lifelong, for the most part, Republican, but he also supported Democrats. He just supported godly, good candidates, and just tried to support people. He wasn't a big politico necessarily, although he often told the story of hobnobbing around with his friend Rocky, Nelson Rockefeller. And my dad told me recently a couple stories, one of which, and I'll just give you a truncated or short version. He was at Botanico, and he used to walk around the property with, Governor Nelson Rockefeller, and was, just having a regular time of visit with him. And they had an event. Maybe it might have been in Albany, I don't know. But they were coming back, my mom and my dad speeding back. And there's two stories, and I'll tell them quickly. We're speeding back, and we got pulled over by an officer, and he said, "Where are you coming from?" And my father said, "Oh, God bless, I apologize again. And to keep this message at only an hour, I only have about 14 more minutes to speak about my beloved daddy. Although I could talk about him, and may God give me the strength and grace and length of life to do that for the rest of my life, because I spent the last 33 years devoted to serving my dad. And he was and will always be my best friend. And the one I most want to make proud, and the one I most love and live for." And so I'll go back to that political story I was telling. My dad was coming back, and so the cop came up to the car door, and my mom was, a little bit ill, and that's why he was rushing to drive. Neither was drinking or driving or anything. My dad seldom drank, and neither did my mom, ever, I don't think. Maybe a glass of wine periodically, once every year or two, maybe, or twice a year. Not even that. But anyway, so the cop said, "Where are you coming from?" And my dad said, "From the governor's." And the cop was like, "Okay, get out of the car, wise guy." The way my dad would tell the story. And so he gives him his name and information, and gives the cop a piece of paper, I guess, with a name and a number on it. And my father, the cop, goes on his radio and relays the information, goes back to the door where my father was, and says, "Oh, Mr. DiBello, I'm so terribly sorry to have detained you. Can I escort you and give you a ride, lead you home?" So my dad got a kick out of that story. And then there was another one I can relay at some point, perhaps. So while I was saying about my dad having, this children to carry on his life and his legacy, and that of he and my mom, and Lisa had some political background, and then there's Bradley, who certainly has a gift of music, and my dad, as I mentioned, just loved music. All, mostly kind types from his generation. He loved his jukebox and his slop. Well, I get to that in the next in another eulogy, perhaps here, but my dad loved music, especially the generations he grew up with. And then after Brad was Tony Marie, and Tony's had her, things in life, and there's a mother, I think, of two, and my dad loved his grandkids. He wishes he gets to see everybody more, and but there's, there's phases in life, I guess. So anyway, and then after Tony Marie, Amy, who's of the DiBello line, who's sort of managerial the way my dad was. And then there's Julie, who's, more of a Burek, and she likes to, her life is all about her children and being a mother, and that's just the kind of woman my dad wanted to marry. And then there's little Susie, who was born with spina bifida, but it didn't stop her from living. And my mom and dad were heartbroken at the way Susie was born, but they worked, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the clock, but they worked so hard through Susie's life to give her a normal life. And I know how grateful, even though I don't know the level of their communication, and people drift in families, especially when you have 8, they get, other interests and such. But, my dad loved all his children. And so I just remember, after, as the children progressed being born, he had an article in his Greenbush Area News thanking the doctor for giving birth and the stork bringing Susan. And I mention that because it kind of parallels my dad's business ventures and publishing, which would become after the Greenbush News, our local paper, which all the kids in one capacity or another were taught to work at, not just for the life lessons that come with hard work, but also for the camaraderie. My dad, a word he liked to use, in the teamwork and the family and the unity and just the joy of the successes that would bring, and even more so when he had started a publication called the Hospital Newspapers Group and Hospital Recruiters. All right, God bless. Well, I'm here for the final phase of this message, this eulogy, not message, to eulogize my dad. Because I think there's supposed to be some kind of closure and peace, but I'll never have peace on this planet while my daddy's not here. But I'll get to that. So, as I was saying, my mom, I was at college. My dad was able to fund me and actually, I believe, Joey and Lisa, and he would have funded Brad. I think also Tony and Amy he did. And Julie he did. And then Susan even, I think, locally to college because he was an educated man, my dad, for somebody who didn't have any real formal education after high school. I was also shocked that both my dad and mom, in retrospect, the class, a word that's used a lot in horse racing. Like I said, Dad loved horse racing. He loved football especially, but all sports. But certainly loved his children participating in those sports. But my dad had a lot of class, and even taught my mom a thing or two in a good way. And but anyway, so my mom, I'm not sure why I digressed to that. I apologize. But then my mom, I was at college. I think that's why. And then we got the call that my mom, we thought at first it was hepatitis, and she was yellow. And then we learned later it was pancreatic cancer, and that Mom would be gone probably within 2 years. So my dad did everything possible to make my mom's remaining year or two comfortable. And I remember we all sort of relocated to Massachusetts General because they had the best cancer team in the country at the time, I guess. And my dad used to sleep in the bed next to my mom. And I remember preparing for football and running around the St. Charles River Basin to exercise. But my dad spared no expense to save my mom's life and elongate it and for her to have peace when her time came. And we were all there. And I just remember, because I'll be honest, at times, because, when you're cut from the same cloth, sometimes, you rub up against each other the wrong way. And sometimes I'd have some animosity with my dad, but we knew we always loved each other in our hearts. And sometimes I would more gravitate toward my mom, and she would sort of be my favorite parent. And then my dad, because he had to be, a father, and you have to discipline your kids. And sometimes, you don't want to be disciplined, so you go and you seek the nursing of the mom, and really quite traditional, but I guess, which happens in a family, but raised the right way by Mom and Dad, all of us kids, not to swear, not to drink or do drugs, to treat people with love and respect, and love each other and stick together, and loyalty and family. I mean, God, the love of sports, and like I said, just in the right way. So on October 17th in 1982, my mom died. And I've heard people say, and I don't know, I guess I got a few minutes left, went to be with heaven be in heaven with the Lord. But I can only say this in preaching. Nobody knows where anybody is other than God. And I might open the next, nobody knows. Only God knows. And it's very, the scripture says, it's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than for somebody basically to get to heaven. That means basically no one. And there's even scriptural references later that says a number of 200,000. Perhaps that's all the total people in heaven. It's very hard to get to heaven, but to assume or presume that where somebody is, in the life-making and changing decision of their spirit for eternity, only God the Heavenly Father knows. There's even a scripture where, when will the time come to an end? Jesus Christ, many believe is the Son of God, and my dad did. He even says, I don't know. Only the Father in heaven knows. And the time and the end of life for most people, when the earth ends one day, it's going to be sometime before that, when their earthly bodies become heavenly bodies. And I don't know where my daddy is. And if I was to be ministerial and preachy and formal, I'd say, I don't know. I don't need to know. All I know is God knows. But after my mom died, my dad got remarried. He met somebody, and then life went on and took something of a different course. Although my dad will still always be my dad, full of love and life in his heart. Sure, he wasn't perfect. He tried to be. He was apologetic when he was wrong. He was, with me, we apologized to each other because when my mom died, I felt so alone that I didn't have anybody. And I remember thrashing on the ground outside of the house, thinking I didn't have anybody. And my dad just I knew he had to be a leader back then, but he was just like, you have your suits ready, boy, like get your start dark. He seemed, I don't want to say, I don't know, I guess he had to do what he had to do, but I was like, I missed my mom, and I had so much love for my mom, and I missed her terribly. I missed her so much after that, but the best thing to ever happen from my mom dying was that I got to know my dad all over again. And he became the love of my life. And I only knew my mom 21 years, but I got to know my dad 3 times that. And I once said to somebody, I'm probably 10 times better and 10 times worse than my dad, being an extension of him, but I could never be 10 times better than my dad because he was my father. He gave life to me and to his other children. We don't exist were it not for him. He is my dad. And I will always and forever live my life in love with him, in adoration of him. He, like I said, was a god to me. He was a hero. He was my best friend. I would live to my life as ever long as it is, whether it's I end by my own hand or foolish stupidity through the evil one who comes to get me, or through just some illness or natural passing, although I just think it doesn't matter how I go. I look forward to the day, although I cherish and value and love life, that God takes me, and I pray to God. My mom and dad are in heaven. I pray and hope and believe perhaps now they are. Although I'll never know, but I can't wait to know, because when we get there, my dad, we loved Rennie, and then we had Shimmy, or Coco, I'm sorry, and then Shimmy and Nugget, and then the horses, and all the critters, but there was a break, but I'm just going to close by saying God is the Heavenly Father, the first Father for all of humanity, the first Father for the Creator of the universe and the animal kingdom and all of humanity, and the mother and father, and especially now Dad, who mean life to me. And while we're never supposed to take a life, I know I'll have times of depression and sadness, and times where it's beyond my own control, but a forceful evil that will want me to take my life. But I want to honor my Heavenly Father, but secondly, I'm sorry, my earthly father, and try to live, I guess, as best I can in my remaining days or years in honor and memory of him and my mom before him. As I hope a tribute to them. And I can only hope and pray in the end that I see them again, because I don't care about anything in life right now other than just I don't even care about documenting much of my life, because I am nothing without my mom and dad. Nothing but what's left here behind. And I'm sorry if I'm being selfish about this. I don't care. I don't care what people think. I care what God thinks. I care what my mom will think I pray I see her again, and my dad, I pray I see him again. This is who I am. I'm the son of Dorothy, Leona, Burek, DiBello, and Anthony Francis DiBello. God bless and peace.